She lost his leg to an IED, gave 30 years to the country, and now some polyester-clad suburban queenpin with a clipboard thinks his wheelchair ramp is visually disruptive? Lady, you just picked a fight with the Pentagon. Frank Delaney had seen war. He had stared down the barrel of insurgent rifles, crawled through bombed-out alleyways with shrapnel in his side, and watched brothers-in-arms fall while carrying their country's flag. What he hadn't prepared for, what all his military training never covered, was dealing with an HOA president named Karen Beasley who wore pastel tracksuits like armor and considered her clipboard a weapon of mass control. Frank wasn't just any old man. He was a decorated veteran, recipient of the Bronze Star, and the kind of guy who still stood for the national anthem even when his prosthetic leg gave him hell. He wasn't flashy. He kept to himself, grew tomatoes in his backyard, and taught the neighborhood boys how to fix a bike chain or clean a wound. His house was modest, his lawn tidy, and his service dog Max never barked unless someone tried to touch the flagpole. It was that flagpole, ironically, that began the war. It started with a letter. Violation notice. Unauthorized flag display and ramp obstruction, action required. Frank had chuckled when he first saw it, thinking it was a clerical error. The ramp in question was county-approved and built by a group of Boy Scouts as part of an Eagle project. The flagpole had been there since he bought the property. But the HOA had just elected Karen, a woman whose sense of power grew tenfold with every signature she collected. She didn't see a veteran's home. She saw a non-conforming structure with rough edges. She knocked on Frank's door one afternoon, heels clicking against the walkway like warning shot. "I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to remove that ramp. It's not aesthetically consistent with community guidelines," she chirped, not even glancing at Frank's prosthetic leg. "And what guidelines would those be?" Frank asked, arms folded as Max growled low behind him. Karen tapped her clipboard. Page 16, subsection 4. All modifications visible from the street must be pre-approved and maintain uniform design specifications. Also, the flagpole, it exceeds height regulations. It's the same height as the one outside the firehouse. Yes, well, this isn't a firehouse. This is Ridgefield Glen Estates, she said, like she was reciting scripture. We have standards. Frank shut the door without another word. The next few weeks were a blur of escalating nonsense. Fines appeared in his mailbox daily, ranging from improper trash can placement to unauthorized tomato planting. A particularly baffling violation cited him for non-neutral fence paint, referring to the light oak finish that had been there for years. Karen had become a tyrant in a golf cart, patrolling the neighborhood like a one-woman militia. But Frank stood his ground. He had faced worse. Until one morning when he didn't. It was barely 8 a.m. when the pounding came at the door. Frank shuffled to open it, already expecting some new petty confrontation. But instead of Karen, it was two uniformed sheriff deputies flanked by a clipboard-wielding HOA representative. Karen stood behind them, lips pursed like she was watching a prize-winning roast in the oven. "Mr. Delaney, per Civil Court Order 497C, you have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Failure to comply will result in forced eviction." Frank blinked. "You're evicting me?" "For a ramp." "For repeated non-compliance," Karen said. "An outstanding dues. I paid my dues for 20 years. Well, your property's been reassessed under the new enhancement guidelines. That includes fines." Frank didn't remember much after that. He remembered Max barking. He remembered a neighbor trying to intervene and being told to stand down. He remembered grabbing a box of his medals and falling hard on the steps when he tried to carry them himself. That fall sent him to the ER with a sprained wrist and a panic attack so severe he had to be sedated. But the worst moment came later, as he lay in a hospital bed with dried blood on his temple and his hand still trembling. A nurse walked in and gently said, "They took your dog, sir. Said he didn't have the right tags for that neighborhood. Animal control has him now." Frank stared at the ceiling, silent. His medals were scattered in a cardboard box. His flag torn down. His ramp ripped out by a contractor who'd been hired on the HOA's dime. And Max, the one soul who'd stayed by his side through everything, was gone. The nurse leaned closer. "Is there anyone you want to call?" Frank's lips moved slowly. "Yeah, my daughter." She handed him the phone. He scrolled to a contact labeled Angel. He pressed dial. He didn't say much. Just a few words rasped through gritted teeth. "They evicted me. Took the ramp, the flag and Max." There was a pause on the other end. Then, a calm, chillingly precise voice answered, "Don't worry, Dad. I'm bringing everything." And then she hung up. In the silence of the hospital room, Frank smiled for the first time in days. Because what Karen and her HOA crew didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that his daughter wasn't just an angry family member coming to file a complaint. She was a senior analyst in the Department of Defense, with top-level clearance, military contacts across every branch, and more tactical experience than most generals. She had turned insurgent villages into negotiation zones, coordinated airstrikes in real time, and rewritten defense protocol with a ballpoint pen and a laptop. And now she was coming to deal with a woman who thought a flower bed out of alignment was a federal offense. What started as a petty ramp violation was about to become a full-scale legal ambush. And this time, Frank wouldn't be fighting alone. This time, the Pentagon was coming to suburbia. Jenna Delaney arrived the next morning on a red-eye flight from Washington, D.C., stepping off the plane with a military-grade duffel bag slung across one shoulder and steel in her eyes. Her boots hit the pavement with the kind of rhythm that made men twice her size stand straighter. She wasn't wearing full uniform, but the Pentagon badge clipped to her collar said everything anyone needed to know. She didn't come to argue. She came to dismantle. By the time she made it to the hospital, her father was sitting up in bed, bruised and stitched but stubborn as ever. Max's absence was the first thing she noticed. The second was the way her father's hands trembled when he tried to hand her his eviction notice. Jenna didn't speak for a full minute. She just read the document silently, her eyes narrowing with each line. Then, without breaking eye contact, she asked one question. "Do they know who I am?" Frank chuckled, winced, then shook his head. "I didn't think it would get this far." Jenna's jaw tightened. "They made it far. I'll make sure they don't get any farther." Before noon, Jenna was at the property. Not the hospital, not her father's temporary housing. She went straight to the battlefield. Ridgefield Glen Estate. She moved through the streets with quiet observation, noting security cameras, HOA signs, the model numbers on parking enforcement vehicles. She wasn't just looking for violations. She was profiling the enemy. From the manicured hedges to the pastel plastic flamingos, she catalogued every rule the HOA broke while enforcing others. She watched an HOA board member park illegally in a fire zone. She watched another smoke a cigar directly beneath a "no smoking" sign. She took photos, logged timestamps, recorded casual conversations, and logged every hypocritical move in a digital report labeled Operation Clipboard. She didn't confront anyone. Not yet. That wasn't her style. Her style was precision. So she checked into a small rental property nearby and turned the living room into a mobile command center. Laptop open, tablet synced, secure line plugged into a private satellite feed. She accessed the Ridgefield Glen County zoning database, ran permit checks on every board member's home, and pulled archived footage from public cameras installed 2 years ago. And then she made the call. Colonel Brantley owed her 3 favors. She called in 2. Within hours, 2 nondescript men in black suits were walking through the HOA office with federal credentials disguised as property assessors. They didn't say much. Just requested documentation, photographed filing cabinets, and made copies of Karen Beasley's emails and print record. Meanwhile, Jenna was in the air. Literally. She had brought a compact tactical drone, small enough to look like a toy, but equipped with surveillance software cleared for Pentagon training exercises. She launched it from a park bench and guided it over HOA headquarters, capturing Karen through her open office blinds yelling at a junior board member about a situation with that one-legged nuisance and his attack dog. Jenna's eyebrow arched. That little clip alone would be enough for a discrimination claim. But the drone also captured something more interesting. On Karen's desk was a file marked Delaney, Long-Term Strategy. Jenna zoomed in and read it frame by frame. The HOA had been plotting Frank's removal for months, fabricating violations and intentionally inflating fines to build a case for eviction. Karen had called it community cleansing. That was all Jenna needed. The next phase began at 6 a.m. the following day, when the HOA board received formal requests for financial disclosures from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. A letter also arrived addressed to Karen directly, bearing the seal of the Pentagon, marked time-sensitive review of zoning and discrimination practices. The HOA went into a full panic. Karen called an emergency meeting, locking the doors and speaking in frantic whispers, but the damage was done. Jenna had already sent anonymous tips to 2 local news reporters and one extremely popular TikTok lawyer who specialized in HOA lawsuit. A video compilation of Karen harassing Frank played over dramatic music and racked up 1.4 million views in a single day. The comments were brutal. Jenna watched the fallout from her laptop, sipping black coffee and writing notes. The real kill shot hadn't even come yet. She compiled her findings into a 72-page report, complete with drone footage, screenshots of internal HOA memos, zoning violations committed by Karen herself, and neighbor testimonials, some of which included audio of Karen referring to disabled veterans as neighborhood detractions. Jenna wrapped it all in a tidy digital package and submitted it to 3 offices: the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the state. At the next HOA meeting, only 3 board members showed up. The others had already resigned. Karen tried to carry on, pretending nothing was wrong, but she was sweating through her blouse. She announced that the HOA would be revisiting several complaints and seeking a path to unity. But her voice cracked mid-sentence, and a neighbor shouted, "Then why did you evict a veteran?" The room erupted. People who had once stayed silent were now emboldened. Someone else added, "Why didn't you evict Jason? His RV's been parked on the sidewalk for weeks." Karen tried to gavel the meeting into order, but her authority was unraveling like thread caught on a nail. Later that night, Jenna visited the animal shelter. She had already filed a federal request for Max's release citing wrongful seizure under ADA violation code. She didn't need to argue. Once they saw the documentation and Jenna's clearance, they handed Max over without a word. The dog barked once, then whined, then leapt into her arms. She drove straight to her father's temporary apartment and knocked. Frank opened the door, looking surprised. "Got room for one more?" Jenna asked. Max ran in like he'd never left. That moment, the look on Frank's face as his dog tackled him to the floor and licked his cheek, was when Jenna knew this wasn't just revenge. This was justice in motion. But she also knew they weren't done yet. The HOA had started a fire they couldn't put out, and the flames were only getting higher. The next morning, a black SUV pulled into Ridgefield Glen Estate. 2 men in dark suits stepped out with briefcases. Karen, watching from her office window, turned pale. A neighbor snapped a picture of them walking in, and within an hour, the image was circulating online under the caption, "Feds in the HOA? This ain't gonna end well for Karen." And it wouldn't. Because while Karen thought she'd pushed out an old man with no fight left in him, she had accidentally declared war on a woman with military intelligence, federal backing, and no patience for petty tyrants. This was no longer just about a ramp or a flag. This was about principle. And Jenna Delaney had only just begun. The day started with a quiet knock on the door of Frank Delaney's temporary housing unit, but what followed would ripple through the entire county like a bomb dropped in a still pond. It was Jenna, holding a leash in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. Max trotted beside her, looking like he'd just won a trophy. Frank opened the door, and without a word, Max lunged forward, tail wagging so violently it thudded against the walls. The reunion was quiet, emotional, and heavy with everything unspoken. Frank knelt, one arm around Max, the other wiping his eye. Then Jenna handed him the envelope. It contained a list, names, signatures, timestamps, all from neighbors who had submitted HOA complaints about Karen and her practices over the years. Most of them were ignored or buried. Now they were resurfaced and filed under a formal civilian support document attached to a class action complaint Jenna was building. Frank looked up at her and said what he hadn't been able to say in years. "You always knew how to aim for the heart." While they drank coffee in silence, the real show was beginning online. Jenna had discreetly leaked a portion of the drone footage, just a few seconds, to a popular local news account. It showed Karen speaking to another board member saying, "These old war types think they own everything just because they've got medals. Well, this isn't a military base. It's my community now." That clip alone sparked a wildfire. By noon, news crews were parked outside Ridgefield Glen Estate. A news van set up across from the HOA office. Neighbors began filming with their phones, uploading videos with captions like, "Karen's getting nuked," and "HOA dictator under siege." But Jenna wasn't watching the screens. She was watching the people. She saw neighbors begin to talk to each other again, exchanging stories in driveways, waving where once they'd looked away. A biker in a leather vest and Vietnam patch rolled into the neighborhood on a Harley and parked it right on the HOA's precious front lawn. He planted a sign beside it that read, "Veterans Welcome, Karen Not." No one dared move it. Then came the VFW convoy. A caravan of trucks, jeeps, and motorcycles draped in American flags rolled through the streets like a rolling thunderstorm. They didn't block traffic. They didn't shout. They just stood, veterans of all ages, outside the HOA office in silence. It was louder than any protest. Karen peeked through the blinds, her face drained of color. Jenna moved fast. She met with a legal contact over lunch and handed off two things: a hard drive containing everything she'd gathered and a notarized petition requesting an immediate injunction against the HOA for discriminatory eviction, abuse of zoning authority, and theft of a service animal. Her contact smiled and said, "I've never seen a case wrapped this tightly. You didn't just prepare, you brought the whole armory." Jenna only nodded. She wasn't here for praise. She was here for results. By the following morning, the headlines were national. "Veteran evicted by HOA sparks Pentagon response." Karen's name was trending across platforms, but not in the way she hoped. Clips of her in HOA meetings, her shrill voice demanding flagpoles be no taller than mailboxes, played with mocking subtitles and laugh tracks. A parody song using her voice and dubbed over military drums climbed to thousands of views. Karen tried to issue a public statement, but it backfired spectacularly when a reporter asked, "Do you regret evicting a disabled veteran?" And she responded, "I regret he didn't follow the rules." That quote made the front page. Jenna, meanwhile, wasn't slowing down. She uncovered records showing Karen had filed over 90 complaints in the last 2 years, 70 of which targeted veterans, disabled residents, or non-native English speakers. The pattern was clear, and Jenna now had legal analysts from the Department of Justice looking into potential civil rights violations. But what really lit the fire was the hidden detail buried in Karen's own house permit. Jenna discovered that Karen's wine cellar, an underground expansion she bragged about in an HOA newsletter, had never been approved by county zoning. Worse, it was constructed partially under a shared sidewalk, making it a public hazard and a liability nightmare. Jenna filed the violation anonymously. The very next day, a county inspector showed up with a clipboard and a flashlight. Karen screamed at him to leave her property. He handed her a citation and walked away smiling. Inside HOA headquarters, panic was setting in. Board members were jumping ship, some offering statements in exchange for immunity. One member handed over a flash drive containing years of internal emails. Among them were messages that read like a movie script of corruption, planned evictions of retirees to make room for higher-yield homeowners, fake fines imposed on immigrants because they won't fight back, and personal payments Karen collected from shady contractors for HOA-approved jobs. Jenna took one look and said, "This isn't just petty tyranny. This is organized fraud." Frank watched all of it unfold from his temporary apartment. He wasn't used to seeing justice move this fast. He wasn't used to seeing himself defended. All he'd known was survival, quiet dignity, and a bitter taste left by too many betrayals. But now his neighbors waved when they saw him. One brought him a pie. Another gave Max a new collar that said, "Neighborhood Hero." For once, the silence was gone. In its place, laughter, support, and something even deeper, respect. Then came the cease and desist letter. It arrived in a black government envelope, sealed and stamped. Jenna didn't even smile as she delivered it to Karen personally. She walked right into the HOA office, dropped it on the desk, and said, "Effective immediately, all enforcement authority is suspended pending federal review." Karen reached for the envelope, hands shaking. Jenna leaned forward and added, "By the way, your illegal wine cellar? The county says it needs to be filled in. Have a nice day." Then she walked out. Karen stood there frozen, surrounded by the collapsing empire she'd built on control, fear, and paper-thin power. Outside, Frank drove by, riding shotgun in a neighbor's truck, Max's head poking out the back window. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to salute to feel like a soldier again. Because this battle wasn't fought with weapons or marching boot. It was fought with truth, loyalty, and a daughter who knew exactly how to bring the whole system to its knees. And still, Jenna wasn't done. Not yet. This was just the fallout. The reckoning was still to come. Karen Beasley wasn't used to losing. Her entire identity was built around control, controlling lawns, trash bins, mailbox colors, and the width of American flags. But now, her grip was slipping. Board members had deserted her, her inbox was flooded with legal demands, and her face was now a national symbol of small-town tyranny. Every attempt she made to restore order only exposed more of her hypocrisy. When she tried to schedule a community meeting to address the recent misinformation, only 3 people showed up, and one of them was just there for the free donuts. Still, Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. She was cornered, humiliated, and desperate. And that made her dangerous. In a last-ditch attempt to salvage what she could, Karen paid a visit to a county commissioner with whom she'd once exchanged favors over property variances. She slid an envelope across his desk, filled with photos, leverage, and veiled threats. She expected him to fold. Instead, he glanced at the envelope, pushed it back across the desk, and said, "You should be more careful who you threaten. The people watching you now don't blink." Karen left that office shaken and furious, but not defeated. She still had one card left to play. That night, Jenna received an unexpected call. It was from a lawyer representing Karen, offering a settlement. The lawyer was slick, soft-spoken, and full of fake sympathy. He suggested that Karen was willing to make amends by publicly apologizing, reinstating Frank's housing rights, and paying a token amount in damages. If, of course, Jenna agreed to drop all legal actions and scrub the videos from public view. Jenna didn't even respond immediately. She just hit the record button on her phone and leaned back. After 5 minutes of carefully worded spin, she finally spoke. "Let me be perfectly clear. There's not enough money in this state to cover what you took from my father. You think this is about a house? This is about every disabled vet who's ever been pushed out of a place they served to protect. You want to settle? Settle in court." The lawyer stuttered and hung up. Jenna filed the recording as Exhibit 49. By the end of that week, the civil rights lawsuit was officially filed. Jenna worked with 3 attorneys, one specializing in ADA violations, one in HOA fraud, and one who was a retired JAD officer she knew from a military tribunal in Germany. The lawsuit named not only Karen but the entire Ridgefield Glen HOA, citing patterns of systemic discrimination, abuse of power, targeted harassment and misuse of community funds. The document was airtight. The evidence was overwhelming. And the plaintiff list was growing. Jenna had gathered not just Frank's story, but testimonies from others who had been quietly run out of the community for reasons as petty as window tint or the number of garden gnomes in their yard. Each account was backed by documents, timestamps, and now a growing crowd of supporters. Karen's allies, the few that remained, began to turn on her one by one. Some offered statements. Others delivered hard drives. One board member showed up at Jenna's rental home with a manila folder full of bank statements showing that HOA dues had been funneled into a discretionary account used for spa retreats, designer furniture, and, most ironically, a security system Karen had installed to protect herself from hostile residents. Jenna added it to the lawsuit with clinical efficiency. Every betrayal deepened the cracks in Karen's crumbling foundation. Then came the IRS. The Department of Treasury launched an investigation into the HOA's tax filings. Apparently, several charitable donation claims had been made on community improvement projects that didn't exist. A sidewalk lighting upgrade that was never completed. A memorial plaque that was never installed. A neighborhood scholarship fund that had no record. Jenna wasn't behind the IRS probe, but her fingerprints were all over the paper trail that triggered it. When she saw the notice taped to the HOA office door, she simply smiled and said, "Funny how justice has such good timing." Still, the cherry on top came the following Saturday when Karen attempted to hold a press conference in front of the HOA fountain. She set up a podium, printed a banner that read, "Restoring Harmony," and invited a local news team. But the moment she stepped to the mic, she was drowned out by the roar of a nearby convoy. 10 trucks, each flying military flags, rolled past in a perfect line. Veterans stood on flatbeds holding signs that read, "This is what honor looks like, and you evicted a hero. We evicted you." Karen froze, mid-sentence, trying to wave off the cameras. But it was too late. The moment was live-streamed, clipped, and turned into the viral moment of the week. A meme soon followed, Karen holding a mic with the caption, "I demand silence," and a sea of veterans rolling by behind her. The final blow came later that day when Karen received a formal letter from the county magistrate's office stating that due to multiple zoning and governance violations, her authority within the HOA was officially suspended pending a full judicial review. She was no longer president. Her access to HOA funds was revoked. She wasn't even allowed to set foot in the office without a court liaison present. For someone who once treated her clipboard like a scepter, the fall from power was devastating. But it wasn't over yet. Jenna purchased the vacant home across the street from the former HOA office under an LLC named Liberty Hill Partners. She spent 2 days overseeing renovations, hired local contractors, and refused to answer questions about what the building would become. Then, without ceremony, a large banner was hung from the porch. Veterans Legal Aid, free consultations. Walk-ins welcome. Frank stood across the street when the sign went up, hand over his heart. Jenna stood beside him, arms folded, sunglasses on. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Inside the building, Jenna set up a small office with a coffee maker, a folding desk, and a stack of fresh pamphlets detailing veterans' rights in housing communities. The message was clear. They weren't just finishing a battle. They were starting a movement. One where people like Karen wouldn't get to hide behind fake authority and flowery HOA jargon. One where people like Frank could live with dignity, without fear of eviction disguised as enforcement. As the sun set on Ridgefield Glen that evening, the neighborhood was quieter than it had been in weeks. No more screaming from office windows. No more pink violation slips fluttering in mailboxes. Just wind through the trees, the sound of kids playing, and Max snoring peacefully on Frank's lap. Across the street, Karen sat alone in her darkened house, staring at the legal aid office glowing softly in the twilight. She used to run this place. Now she wasn't even welcome to park on her own curb. And Jenna? She was already planning Phase 5. Because justice didn't just mean winning. It meant making sure no one like Karen ever tried something like this again. Frank returned to his home exactly 61 days after he was unjustly evicted, but when he crossed the threshold, it felt like 60 years had passed. The ramp that had been ripped out was now rebuilt, stronger, smoother, reinforced with stainless steel edges and engraved near the base with words that left no room for HOA interference. Property of Sergeant Frank Delaney, ADA compliant. The flagpole stood tall once more, freshly painted and secured with a weatherproof base, and above it, waving gently in the breeze, was the same flag that had been in his yard for 20 years, folded and stored carefully by Jenna during the chaos, now unfurled in full glory. Neighbors stood by silently as he approached, many holding small flags of their own. A few clapped, some saluted, and one young boy handed Frank a crayon drawing of Max, standing guard next to a flag that reached the clouds. Jenna walked a few steps behind him, letting him take it all in. She had coordinated everything. The legal reinstatement of his home, the dismissal of every bogus fine, the physical restoration of every item the HOA had destroyed. But what she couldn't plan for was the emotion in her father's eyes as he stood on his porch again, Max at his side, the sun warming his face. He didn't cry, not exactly. But his shoulders sagged with a release he hadn't felt in decades. For the first time since the day he left the military, he felt like he was finally home. In the days that followed, Ridgefield Glen began to resemble something it had never truly been before, a community. Without Karen's iron grip on the HOA, residents began connecting, organizing real meetings where voices weren't silenced and decisions weren't dictated by a single clipboard. A new interim board was formed, made up of long-term residents, a retired school principal, a nurse, and even a veteran who had once kept silent about his own HOA harassment. Their first act was to pass what they called the Frank Amendment. Any resident with a disability could make modifications to their property without needing aesthetic approval. The vote passed unanimously. Karen, now stripped of all HOA power and facing multiple civil charges, tried to file a countersuit for defamation and harassment. The judge threw it out in 5 minutes after reading the compiled evidence. Her reputation was in shambles. No law firm would touch her case. She had been dropped by her former attorney after he realized he was likely going to be called as a witness in the ongoing fraud probe. With mounting legal costs, a suspended driver's license due to unpaid HOA vehicle citations, and public disdain trailing her like a storm cloud, Karen finally sold her house. It was listed online for far less than market value with the description, previously governed community, quiet location, needs minor repairs. What truly sealed the story's ending, however, wasn't in courtrooms or on news broadcasts. It came one afternoon when Jenna was invited to a veterans ceremony at a nearby military base. She expected it to be brief, handshakes, thank yous, maybe a plaque. But instead, she found herself on stage beside her father, surrounded by soldiers, officers, and state officials. A general took the mic and began recounting the events that had unfolded in Ridgefield Glen, not as a scandal, but as a case study in how civilian systems sometimes fail those they're supposed to protect, and how courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Jenna was awarded a service medal, not for combat, but for extraordinary defense of veteran rights. Frank received a standing ovation that lasted nearly a full minute. He shook every hand, hugged every service dog, and finally leaned in close to his daughter and said, "If your mother could see this, she'd say we're finally even. I gave you piggyback rides through war zones. Now you carried me through this one." Jenna laughed and wiped her eyes. It was the only time she let herself cry. Later that week, she unveiled a small addition to the Veterans Legal Aid Office, an open porch area with rocking chairs, free Wi-Fi, and a community bookshelf stocked with everything from legal guides to dog training manuals. It became a gathering place, a safe space where no one needed to show credentials to be heard. On the first morning after its completion, a man who had served in Korea wandered in and simply said, "Heard there's a place around here where we matter." Frank was already waiting with a fresh pot of coffee and 2 mugs. Across the street, the old HOA office was shuttered, its windows boarded and sign removed. A real estate sign stood in front of it, but no one had made an offer. Rumor had it someone was planning to buy the land, just to turn it into a community park and name it after Mac. Whether true or not, no one protested the idea. As weeks turned to months, the story began to fade from headlines, replaced by the next outrage, the next scandal. But in Ridgefield Glen, the impact never dulled. The community that had once tolerated injustice out of fear now stood together, stronger and wiser. The message Jenna left behind wasn't one of revenge, it was one of consequence. That when people abuse power, when they target the vulnerable, when they mistake silence for weakness, they invite a response that might be louder, stronger, and far more permanent than they ever expected. On one quiet evening, long after the chaos had passed, Frank sat on his porch, Max curled beside him, eyes closed. He looked out over the street where everything had once gone wrong and now, somehow, felt perfectly right. He didn't think of the pain, or the fear, or even the betrayal. He thought of the ramp, the flag, the porch light Jenna had personally reinstalled. He thought of every neighbor who had once looked away now stopping to say hello. He thought of his daughter, typing furiously late into the night, tearing down walls with nothing more than facts and fire. And then he looked down at the golden letters etched into the base of his new ramp. They read simply, "Built back stronger. Protected by family." Frank smiled, leaned back in his chair, and whispered, "Let them try it again. See what happens." Then he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and finally, rested.